Hello and welcome. My name is Dan Vermeer. I'm an associate professor of the practice at Fuqua School of Business at Duke University and the executive director for the Center for Energy Development and the Global Environment. Today, I'd like to talk to you about business leadership on climate change and sustainability in the decisive decade. Over the next months and years of this decade, business leaders and society as a whole will face some of the most important decisions that will have implications over the course of the next century and beyond. As all of you know, we're at a moment of converging crisis. On one hand, we have the impacts of climate change with flooding and storms and wildfires, the disruption of our food supply chains in the midst of a pandemic. We have the emergence of racial tensions and challenges in the United States. And all of these things have real implications for business, both the impact that business has on these crises, as well as the role that business might play in these challenges. So we have both bad news and good news about these crises. On one hand, the bad news is that business has been complicit in many of the problems that the world faces now by putting profits over people and not really stepping up as a partner in solving global problems. Business has often missed the opportunity to be a really constructive partner working with government and civil society and the broader citizens of the world around these great challenges. The good news is that new models are emerging fast. The rise of ESG, the bold stands that business leaders have taken on these issues, and the growing momentum to take real action to address things like racial justice and climate change in the context of business means that this is a real moment of opportunity. Business leaders need to transition from thinking narrowly of themselves as business leaders and really begin to think about themselves as citizens of the world. In the midst of these converging crises, climate change is the great amplifier. It is connected to and amplifying the effects of almost all of the other crises that we face, from global health crises to food security issues to racial justice and inequality. And over the last year, we've had some really harrowing reports about the current state of climate change. The IPCC's latest report is identifying this as a code red for humanity. What they mean by that is that we are rapidly reaching thresholds where climate change tipping points become more likely and where the costs and the disruption of climate change will become more and more amplified each year. As you can see in the slide, there are lots of different ways that climate change plays out in different parts of the world. In some places, it's wildfires. In other places, it's flooding. In other places, it's drought. And so there are many different forms that climate change takes. But all of these, as climate change becomes more and more advanced, have really direct and almost incalculable impacts on our economy, on our society, on our politics, and on our way of life. The last 5 years have been the 5 hottest years on record, and we are seeing increasing costs of these going up every year. In 2020, we had over 20 billion-dollar disasters related to climate change, and that number has been growing every year. So the impacts of climate are not in models projected into the future, they are our lived reality. And so we are facing a challenge unlike any that we have seen before. As business leaders, I think we need to rethink both our language and our methods. For example, one of the most common terms that you hear is about climate risk. But risk suggests that this is something that is a probability at some point in the future, rather than acknowledging that we are in the midst of these impacts now. They are quantifiable and they're growing every year. In terms of our methods, we have used things like cost-benefit analysis over many decades to decide whether it's worth investing in climate change. But what we left out is the social cost of carbon and the potential for climate tipping points, making this really an unsolvable problem. And if you figure in those calculations into the economics of climate change, what you realize is that there is no amount of money and no speed of change that is unjustified in this current environment. We have every reason to invest our resources as intensively as possible on a global basis in order to really get momentum, not just for climate mitigation, but also for the adaptation, which is going to be critical as we see more and more of impacts of climate change in the future. And beyond climate change, we're actually facing several interacting crises. For example, some of the work coming out of Stockholm Resilience Center has identified a whole set of planetary boundaries, which are the ecological limits past which we really see systems starting to degrade and collapse. And climate change is certainly one of those. But in addition, we face a really rapid loss of biodiversity around the world, both plant and animal, which has real implications for the stability of ecosystems, as well as the wealth of biodiversity that we'll have in the future. Additionally, issues of inequality can't be separated from climate change. Some of the most vulnerable people in the world who have contributed the least to the problem are experiencing the real brunt of impacts of climate change, as well as lack of access to education and healthcare and ability to build wealth and all of the other things it takes to really live a flourishing life. So while climate change is really important, it's important to not be too focused on climate change alone, but understand how these issues are intimately related to each other and how our solution methods need not to be incremental or single-focused, but really we need to develop a methodology for multi-solving. We need to be able to solve multiple problems simultaneously. And now that is obviously more complex, but the silver lining here is if we are systemic in the way that we think about these issues, we can find real opportunities to make change in climate change and social inequality and biodiversity loss and health impacts and a number of other areas by integrated both policy and business strategies that can help us make progress on multiple fronts simultaneously. So I think this is the silver lining for business leaders, is to really take a systemic approach to these issues and understand how finite actions can have a multiple set of positive impacts. Additionally, we're recognizing that the character of the risk landscape for business is changing really fast. This is a complicated graphic that comes from the World Economic Forum, but over the last several years, they have evaluated, using experts placed around the world, what are the big risks that face business that they need to be aware of and really plan for. And you can see, working from the bottom of this map up, many of the problems in a decade or more ago were related to financial or social or health impacts. But over time, the consensus view of this group of experts that they survey every year has identified climate change and its associated knock-on cascading of impacts as being the primary risks that are driving change for business. So this is no longer an issue that can be managed as a kind of corporate hygiene or corporate responsibility issue. This is really a board level and C-suite issue to be able to anticipate the coming challenges, to understand the ways that these issues are having an impact on your business today, and to take really proactive action both independently and with others to really manage and de-risk your business, future-proof it for a world that certainly is going to be more disrupted and more volatile. So I think the takeaway message here is that this is really our moment of truth. The 2020s are decisive in our ability to get in front of the climate change issue, not to solve the problem because so many of the impacts are already baked into the current system, but to manage these challenges, both predicted and unpredicted, in a way that doesn't undermine the business and our ability for our societies to really flourish. I think there's a few principles for the 2020s that should guide our thinking. The first is that the pace of change is accelerating, and many accounts of change point to the things that we do, the planned changes that we can take. But increasingly, we're going to see the ratio of change that is unplanned, unpredictable, and asserted to the world, as opposed to the actions that businesses can take on their own. It's not that they lose their agency, but they'll be operating in a world where much of the change is not planned, is not organized, but happens in a very unpredictable and sometimes in a very nonlinear way. The second is that these increasing pressures on our system, not just our climate system, but our economic system, our political system, and the institutions that we all depend on every day, there's a risk that because of the interdependence, the interconnections between these systems, that there's a risk of cascading failures, that a drought in a particular part of the world leads to climate migration, which puts real pressure on the countries that they're going to, which can create problems in terms of food supply, in terms of security, and a whole set of other issues. So these issues are linked in a way that increases the likelihood of cascading failures. This is going to make it very hard to predict what the future is going to hold. And so we were approached recently by a company who had identified a whole list of risks that they knew were likely. But as those risks took the form of real-life incidents, they found that they were really totally unprepared. While they knew the category that the risk might come in, they didn't really understand the scale, how quickly things could move, and how unprepared they were to really address those issues. So I think we're looking at the 2020s as a period where we really are increasingly exposed to unpredictability. Fourth, this is a really once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Because of the convergence of the crises that we're facing, we also have a moment now as we try to recover from the pandemic and build back our institutions and our infrastructure in new ways. This is a once-in-a-generation or maybe once-in-a-century opportunity for us to really take a different approach than we've done in the past. Again, I want to stress that this is not only on the shoulders of business leaders. In fact, business leaders can't do this alone. They have to do it in partnership with others. And so we're going to need different kind of leaders than we've had in the past. Maybe ones that are less focused only on the success of their own business, but really partners with other players in global governance to address these problems in a more profound way. So I think this is a moment of opportunity for really different kinds of leaders. Leaders that come from different demographic backgrounds, leaders who come from different intellectual and disciplinary backgrounds, leaders who can bring a fresh perspective and a different kind of commitment to addressing the need of all their stakeholders rather than only their shareholders. In fact, we are seeing real realignment or reorientation of the markets to these issues. Over the last year, we've seen an explosion of interest and urgency and effort going into formulating environmental, social, and governance standards that can be used as a screen to evaluate the performance of companies. Now, I understand that we're early days and there's lots of challenges in terms of how you actually measure these really new variables in the equation of business success. But I think we are now crossing over into a world where the environmental, social, and governance performance of companies is going to be every bit as important as their profits. And I think we're also going to see that the excellence that companies bring, the leadership that they bring in their ESG efforts and in their partnerships with others will have real-life positive impacts on their profitability and their success as a business. They'll be more resilient. They'll be able to attract more top talent to their organizations. They'll be able to bounce back from crises in new ways. And they'll bring the assets of the business to bear on solving these problems in ways that can create real value. So I'd like to conclude with a few points of guidance for business leaders as they tackle the wicked problems of the next decade and the next century. The idea of wicked problems is that big global challenges tend to be very complex. They tend to be driven by multiple different sources. They tend to be very unpredictable. And the solution paths, there's not one way to solve these problems, but they need to be approached from multiple angles at the same time. So I think we are facing a whole set of wicked problems that require a different kind of methodology and mindset to really solve them. And I'd like to see business leaders really step up and demonstrate what it takes to tackle wicked problems. The first, as I've talked about before, you need to cultivate a multi-solving mindset. What do I mean by that? I mean that business leaders need to not only be focused on the success and the struggles of their own business, they need to invest significantly, personally as well as organizationally, in understanding the challenges of the world. Now, I say that not just because business leaders need to be more altruistic or more responsible, although that may also be true. I really think that's going to be critical for success in the future, is that business leaders understand the complexities of the problems that the world faces in very fine granularity and understand the role that they might play in addressing those problems, and that they can position their assets and their business and the global footprint of that business in a way that can be a constructive partner in helping to multi-solve those kinds of problems. Some people talk about business footprints being the environmental and social impacts, maybe negative impacts of those businesses. But I think we also have to think about the handprints of business, the things that business can do to be a partner in solving global problems. The second thing is that we have spent the last several decades as business leaders finding ways to wring out any inefficiency, any cost in the system, to the extent that we now have a system which is very efficient, very cost-effective, but which is brittle and leaves us vulnerable to unanticipated shocks that can come our way. And I think we really need to think about how do we rebalance from a focus, almost an exclusive focus on efficiency, and really make those investments that may be somewhat less efficient, but create the redundant systems that are more resilient, that are able to come back from shocks and from crises more effectively, and that give us degrees of freedom for how we continue to meet the needs of our customers and of our stakeholders in ways despite the kind of impacts that we experience. The third is that we have to engage across boundaries. And what I mean by this is on several dimensions. One is that business needs to be really a partner working with government and civil society to develop joint understanding and joint plans to address these big global problems. But I also think that there are many boundaries within the organization which business still hasn't really stepped up to. The extent to which they have brought in talent that has different kind of capabilities, who have a different kind of demographic profile, that can bring a different kind of mindset to the organization. So engaging across boundaries also means really thinking about the diversity demographically, but also in terms of thinking and expertise and experience in the world that you can really bring in your organization and bring that to bear on coming up with really new solutions to these problems. I think we need to challenge sacred cows. And I see a lot of apparent schizophrenia in the market. On one hand, businesses that are championing addressing climate change on one hand, but we know that some of the efforts that they're taking in influencing policymakers is not consistent with that point of view. They may argue for their own self-interest in ways that really are in conflict with some of the broader societal goals that we have. And so we're going to have to challenge some of those sacred cows in terms of things like profitability at all costs. In terms of externalities or impacts that aren't currently calculated in the economy but need to be. We're going to have to challenge those ideas to really see how these issues are playing out in the real world, not just the signals that the market is sending, but also really paying attention to the signals that society and our ecosystems are telling us about our performance. And finally, I'd like to wrap up with the idea of positive tipping points. A lot of work in climate change talks about the idea of tipping points. For example, there's a lot of methane that's embedded in the permafrost in Siberia. And as climate change increases, that permafrost melts and releases methane into the environment, creating a lot more forcing of the climate and changing it faster. That's something that we don't have any direct control of, but is triggered by the kind of general growth in emissions from our economy and our transportation systems and so forth. So the idea of tipping points typically has been used to say, look, we may lose control of climate change. The farther we go down these paths, we'll lose the ability to mitigate and adapt our way out of climate change because of the tipping points that will kick in and overwhelm the efforts that we can muster as a society and as an economy. But I really like the idea of positive tipping points, which is that we can create the dynamics that would lead to multiple positive benefits that can be achieved through a sequence of action over time that we really can't see from where we stand now. Let me try to give a specific example of this. In the world of transportation, up until recently, there's been very few alternatives to using fossil fuels to power our trucks and our ships and our cars every day. And that area of emissions continues to grow as more and more people have cars and trucks, and the mobility needs grow as populations grow. You could think of this as a negative tipping point. But there's a possibility, and it usually takes some mixture of business strategy and public policy to effect a change where, with a bit of policy support in the front end and creating the right incentives, people begin to make the choice to opt in to electric vehicles as opposed to a gas-powered vehicle. And in fact, we're seeing this happen in many places in the world. There are some leaders like Norway where that's happening, but we can anticipate that this is something that's going to happen in many parts of the world. Given the policy supports, EVs become cost competitive with gas vehicles, and people opt in because they are willing to pay that price to have a vehicle that has less emissions. And the nice thing about electric vehicles, many of them have capabilities that our gas vehicles don't. Or there might be other benefits that you get in terms of being able to use lanes on the highway or access to service stations, these kinds of things that you wouldn't have otherwise. Over time, this allows us to come down a learning curve, which inevitably brings down the cost and increases the performance of the vehicle in this case, to where we reach another tipping point where it may be possible for the policy supports to be pulled back. And people recognize that these are vehicles that they want to own, and they don't necessarily need that policy support to cover that gap. We get to a point of kind of a new equilibrium with that. Well, that creates a whole set of signals for the market environment to build charging stations, to improve the performance of these vehicles, and maybe even the oil and gas companies to think about how they may not have the same demand for their core product that they've had in the past, and they may play a role in helping to create a new system that is electrified and has a lot lower carbon footprint than they had before. So we can imagine a scenario where we can't get from A to Z now, but we can go through a set of steps that can create the likelihood of a positive tipping point happening a lot more quickly than it would be in a business as usual scenario. So I think we're at a critical moment. We are in the decisive decade to act on climate change, not only climate change, but also biodiversity loss, on global health, and the whole range of other challenges that we have. Fasten your seat belts. We are going to enter a world that will be very turbulent and unpredictable, but I can't imagine a better moment to be going into business, to be able to think creatively and strategically and aspirationally about the role that business can play in addressing the problems that the world faces, to bring the assets that business has to bear on those things, and really step up to be a partner in solving those big problems. I can't imagine a world where business can solve these problems alone, and I think it's hubris to say that business will solve these problems, but I also can't imagine a world where we solve these problems where business isn't a critical player working with others in a different mode, with a different mindset and a different set of tools than they've had in the past. So this is a moment of opportunity, it's a moment of challenge, and I look forward to seeing how business leaders of the future can step up and be part of this grand adventure. Thank you.